My brother stood at the foot of my hospital bed with a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and a notarized document in the other. He smiled at me the way a man smiles at a problem he has already solved. I hadn't even asked the nurse what day it was yet. My left leg was suspended in traction. My collarbone was fractured in 2 places. The morphine made the ceiling tiles breathe. And my brother was already in the room, already smiling, already holding paperwork. He set the lilies on the windowsill without putting them in water. They would be dead by morning. He pulled up a chair close to my bed, close enough that I could smell the peppermint gum he chewed when he was nervous. And he told me how lucky I was to be alive. He told me Mom and Dad hadn't made it. Then he slid the document onto my lap and handed me a pen. I am 32 years old. I am a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I know what a deed transfer looks like. I know what it means when someone drives 4 hours to a hospital room before the sedation has fully worn off and asks you to sign something with a pen that is already uncapped. I told my brother I was tired. I told him my vision was blurry. I told him we could handle all of it later. He kept smiling. He said it was just a formality. He said it was what Mom and Dad would have wanted. I closed my eyes and pretended to drift off. Behind my eyelids, I was running calculations. My parents had owned a property outside Dayton that had been appraised at just over $900,000. 3 acres, a farmhouse, a separate rental cottage that generated consistent income. My father had been meticulous about his estate plan. I had helped him draft parts of it myself, 3 years ago, sitting at his kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad. I knew every clause. I knew every beneficiary designation. I knew, without question, that the property was split equally between my brother and me, with a small portion designated for our aunt, who had helped raise us after our grandmother died. The document my brother had pressed into my lap had not looked like any version of that will. I kept my eyes closed until I heard him stand up, until I heard the chair scrape back, until I heard him say he would come back tomorrow when I was feeling better. I heard him pause at the door. I heard him pick up the document from where he had left it on my blanket. I heard him leave. Then I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling and thought about the first time I understood who my brother really was. I was 9. He was 14. We had a dog named Chester, a beagle mix with 1 white ear, and Chester was my entire world, in the way that only childhood animals can be. My brother had been angry about something that week. Some injustice at school I no longer remember, and he had taken that anger into the backyard and come back inside without the dog, and told my parents Chester had dug under the fence and run off. We put up flyers. My mother cried. I walked the neighborhood for a week. Chester never came back. I was 20 before my brother told me what really happened, laughing about it at Thanksgiving like it was a funny story, like time had transformed cruelty into comedy. He had driven Chester to a park 10 miles away and left him there. He wanted to, he said, see what would happen. I had never told my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I was still protecting him the way I had always protected him. The way the younger sibling of a charming, handsome, convincing older brother learns to absorb the truth of what he is and keep it hidden, because no one will believe you anyway. My parents had believed in my brother the way people believe in weather forecasts. He was their first child. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and he had learned early that those things opened doors for him. When he failed out of his first college, they paid for a second one. When his first business collapsed, they co-signed the loan for a second one. When his marriage ended and the courts ordered him to pay child support, he consistently avoided paying. My mother sent money quietly to his ex-wife because she couldn't stand the idea of her grandchildren going without. I was the one who handled things. I was the one who researched the elder care facilities when Dad's memory started slipping. I was the one who drove up every 3rd weekend to sort their mail and pay their bills online and make sure the gutters were cleaned. I was invisible in the way that competent, reliable people are always invisible. My brother showed up for Christmas with expensive wine and stories about almost deals, and my parents lit up like he was the sun returning after a long winter. He was the dream. I was the infrastructure. And now the infrastructure was lying in a hospital bed with a fractured collarbone, and the dream had shown up with a forged document before the morphine had even metabolized. I asked the night nurse to borrow her personal cell phone. She was a small, practical woman named Denise, who had worked the overnight shift for 11 years and had seen enough to not ask unnecessary questions. I told her it was important. She handed it over. I called my colleague Marcus, who had been practicing estate law for 9 years, and owed me a favor that I had been saving carefully for exactly the kind of emergency I had never actually expected to need it for. I told him everything I could remember about the document, the font, the formatting, the notary stamp in the lower left corner that had been slightly crooked. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I had always respected about him. When I finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "That notary stamp is registered to a woman who lost her commission 8 months ago for misconduct. I need you to stall your brother for 72 hours. I told him I could do that. I also told him to pull my brother's financial records if he could get them through any legitimate channel. I had a feeling we were not dealing with simple greed. Simple greed doesn't drive 4 hours to a hospital room with pre-prepared paperwork. Simple greed doesn't use a disgraced notary. Simple greed is opportunistic. What my brother had done felt like something that had been planned before the accident. something that had been waiting in a drawer for the right moment. It took Marcus 48 hours to confirm what I had already started to suspect. My brother had borrowed $340,000 against a real estate venture that had dissolved 14 months ago. The lender was not a bank. The lender was a private holding company that had a well-documented history of aggressive collection practices. The repayment deadline had been extended twice. The third extension had expired 6 weeks before the car accident that killed my parents. My parents had not known. I had not known. No one had known, because my brother was extraordinarily good at performing solvency. He drove a leased car he couldn't afford, wore a watch he had bought on a payment plan, and talked about upcoming projects with the confident vagueness of someone who has mistaken optimism for a business plan. He needed that property. He needed to sell it immediately, and I was the only obstacle between him and $900,000. When he came back to the hospital the next afternoon, I was ready. I had arranged my face into something soft and confused. I had taken less of the pain medication so that I would be sharp underneath the performance of being foggy. I let him hold my hand. I let him tell me about the funeral arrangements he had already made, the caskets he had already chosen, the obituaries he had already drafted, all without asking me a single thing about any of it. I told him I was having trouble understanding documents right now. I told him the doctors were concerned about a mild traumatic brain injury, and I wasn't supposed to make any decisions for at least 2 weeks. He kept his smile in place, but something moved behind his eyes. A recalculation. He told me that the property taxes were going to be due. He told me that without a clear transfer of authority, the estate could get tied up in probate for years. He told me that I didn't want that, did I? All that legal complexity, all that time. He would handle everything. I just needed to sign. I told him I would think about it. He left the room that day looking like a man who was running out of runway. What he did not know was that Marcus had already filed a formal challenge to the document with the county probate court. What he did not know was that I had spoken to the detective handling my parents' accident and asked a single question. Was the brake system on their car inspected after the crash? It had been a rural highway, ice on the road, a guardrail that had crumpled. The accident report had listed weather and road conditions as contributing factors. No one had looked more closely than that, because there was no reason to look more closely. There was now. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have told this story to people who hear the word revenge and imagine something theatrical, something driven by rage. What I felt during those 2 weeks was not rage. Rage is hot and reactive, and it makes you sloppy. What I felt was the cold, patient clarity of a person who has finally stopped trying to convince herself that the wolf at the door is just a dog acting strangely. I had spent 32 years making excuses for my brother. Soft excuses, gentle ones, the kind you make when you love someone, and the truth is too ugly to hold. He had a difficult adolescence. He had never learned how to manage disappointment. He had always felt overshadowed. I had built him a cathedral of justifications, and every time he did something I could not explain, I added another room. The cathedral was gone now. I had checked out of it permanently. Marcus worked quickly. The original will, the one my father and I had drafted 3 years earlier, was located in a fireproof safe in my parents' bedroom, exactly where I knew it would be. The document my brother had brought to the hospital was compared to the original. The discrepancies were not subtle. The notary seal was fraudulent. 2 of the witness signatures did not match any person in my parents' social circle. The date had been altered in a way that was visible under ultraviolet light. My brother had not hired anyone sophisticated to do this. He had done it himself, or nearly himself, in a hurry, with the resources of a man who was running out of time and options. The detective who had taken my call about the brakes called me back on a Thursday morning. The front brake line on my parents' car had not failed from ice damage or impact. It had been compromised before the crash. Not cut clean through, because that would have been obvious and immediate. Compromised in a way that would hold until sustained pressure was applied. The kind of sustained pressure that comes from driving on a highway, accelerating, and then needing to stop. My parents had driven 40 minutes from their house to the restaurant where they were meeting me for my birthday dinner. My brother had been at their house 2 days before. He had offered to fix a leak under the kitchen sink. He had been in the garage retrieving tools. I did not cry when the detective told me this. I had run out of a certain kind of crying. I lay in my hospital bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling tile in the shape of a crow, and I thought about Chester the dog and the Thanksgiving table and 32 years of quiet, accumulated evidence that I had chosen, again and again, to file away rather than face. Not anymore. Marcus called a meeting. He framed it as an estate mediation, a routine step in the probate process, something my brother's attorney would have advised him to attend. My brother arrived at Marcus's office on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon wearing a charcoal blazer and the expression of a man who believed he still had cards to play. I was not in the room when he arrived. I was in the small conference room adjacent to the main office, watching the feed from the camera Marcus had disclosed to his own recording equipment. Everything legally documented. Everything admissible. Marcus told my brother there was a complication. He told him the probate court had flagged the will for a handwriting analysis, standard procedure, when a document is challenged. He told him the analysis could take 4 to 6 months. He told him this with the measured, regretful tone of a professional delivering bad news he had no personal stake in. My brother's jaw tightened. 4 to 6 months. The private lender was not going to wait 4 to 6 months. He pressed his palms flat on the desk. Then Marcus leaned back and said there was another option. If my brother could demonstrate that I was not mentally competent to manage my share of the estate, that my traumatic brain injury had left me incapable of sound judgment, a conservatorship could be established rapidly. The estate would be released to him as conservator pending my recovery. He could manage the assets, including the property, immediately. He would need to sign a sworn declaration attesting to my mental incapacity. He would need to describe specific examples of my confusion, my inability to make decisions, my dependence on him. Marcus said it gently. He said he hated to even bring it up. He said he understood it was an uncomfortable position for a caring older brother. My brother picked up the pen before Marcus had finished the sentence. He spoke for 7 minutes. I watched on the monitor. His voice was smooth and practiced. He described conversations we had never had. He described behaviors I had never exhibited. He told Marcus I had always been fragile, had always struggled, that the accident had only accelerated a decline he had been quietly worried about for years. He was lying with the fluency of a man who had been practicing his whole life. He signed the declaration. He dated it. He slid it back across the desk with the small, satisfied exhale of someone who believes they have just closed a deal. The door to the adjoining conference room opened. I walked in on my own 2 feet, the walking boot on my left leg making a soft, rhythmic sound on the hardwood floor. My collarbone ached. My hand was steady. My brother looked up. The color left his face the way water leaves a bathtub, fast and complete. I sat down across from him and set my phone on the table between us. On the screen was the recording of everything he had just said. For a long moment, he didn't speak. I watched the machinery of his mind working, the way it always worked, searching for the angle, the pivot, the version of this he could survive. His eyes went to Marcus. His eyes came back to me. He opened his mouth. I spoke first. I told him I knew about the brake line. I told him I knew about the debt. I told him I knew about the notary. I told him that a detective had been building a case file for 11 days and that the case file was very nearly complete. I told him the only question now was whether he wanted to make it worse. He made it worse. He came across the table. Not to embrace me, not to beg. He knocked his chair back and lunged with the specific, mindless fury of a person who has never once in his life been stopped by consequences and cannot process the sensation of a wall. He called me names I will not repeat. He said I had ruined everything. He said if I had just stayed out of it, if I had just trusted him, if I hadn't always been so suspicious and difficult and impossible, none of this would have happened. It was the logic of a man who had confused his sister with a resource. When a resource resists, it is defective. When it fails to serve its purpose, it is the problem. Marcus had pressed a call button under his desk. 2 officers and a detective came through the front door of the office before my brother reached my side of the table. He did not go quietly. He never did anything quietly. He was still talking when they put him in the car, still rearranging the story, still looking for the version in which he was the victim, the misunderstood one, the man betrayed by a world that had never appreciated him. I stood on the sidewalk outside Marcus's office and watched the car until it turned the corner. I did not feel triumph. I felt the specific, structural relief of a building after a load-bearing wall has been properly reinforced. Everything that had been straining could finally rest. The charges came in stages over the following weeks. Criminal fraud, document falsification, conspiracy to commit probate fraud. The brake line investigation concluded with the most serious charge. Vehicular homicide, 2 counts. My parents had not died in an accident. They had been murdered by their son for a piece of land, because he needed money, because he had borrowed more than he could ever repay, and because he had spent a lifetime believing that the people who loved him were required to pay his debts. He had a public defender. The public defender was competent, and did what she could. It was not enough. At sentencing, the judge used the word premeditated 4 times. She used the phrase, betrayal of family trust. She sentenced my brother to 22 years on the vehicular homicide counts alone, with the fraud charges adding additional time. He will not be eligible for any meaningful release until he is older than our father ever got to be. The property went through probate properly. The real will, honored exactly as my father had written it. My aunt received her portion. I received mine. I did not sell it immediately. I sat with it for 4 months. Then I drove out one Saturday morning and walked the 3 acres alone, in the early April light, when the grass was just starting to come back, and I stood at the edge of the backfield where my parents used to watch the fireflies in summer. I sold it in May to a family with 2 kids and a golden retriever. I watched the little girl run straight to the backfield the day they came for the walkthrough, and I thought that seemed right. Happiness should be allowed to replace grief. That is not a betrayal. That is simply what time is for. A letter arrived at my apartment 8 weeks after the sentencing. Department of Corrections return address. My brother's handwriting on the front, the looping, confident cursive of a man who had always believed his words carried special weight. I held it for a moment. I knew what was inside. I had known him for 32 years. There would be a careful architecture of grievance. There would be an explanation for every decision he had made. Logical within the internal universe he had always inhabited. A universe in which other people existed primarily as supporting cast for his story. There would be a request. There is always a request. I did not open it. I did not make a moment of it. I did not stand at the window with it or hold it over a candle or feel anything particularly cinematic. I dropped it into the recycling bin on my way out the door, on top of the junk mail and the empty cardboard. That was a Tuesday. I had a meeting at 9 and good coffee in my travel mug, and the radio was playing something I liked. That was the whole of it. I'm telling you this because I spent a long time being ashamed of how clearly I can see my brother now. There is a particular social pressure that comes with having a family member who causes destruction at scale. People want you to search for the wound underneath the behavior, the trauma that explains it, the redeemable human inside the damage. And sometimes that search is meaningful, and sometimes it is just a way of making the people witnessing the harm feel more comfortable than the person absorbing it. I looked for my brother's wound for 32 years. I found it, too, more than once. And here is what I learned. A wound explains behavior. It does not excuse it. It does not protect you from it. It does not mean you are required to keep absorbing it just because you understand its origin. My brother was shaped by parents who handed him the world, and then looked at me to pick up the pieces when he dropped it. That is real. That matters. And it is also true that he drove out to a house and compromised a brake line, and sent two people he was supposed to love onto an icy highway, because he needed money and had decided that other people's lives were a currency he was entitled to spend. Both things are true. The wound and the choice. The explanation and the consequence. I stopped confusing the first for the second a long time ago. There are 3 things I want you to take from this. If you are sitting somewhere right now recognizing someone in this story, not because I think you need to be told what to do with your own life, but because these are the things I wish someone had said plainly to me when I was 9 years old watching a dog I loved disappear and already starting to build the explanations. The first is this. History is not obligation. The length of time someone has been in your life does not determine the weight of what they owe you or what you owe them. 32 years is a long time to know someone. It is also just a number. It does not mean you have to continue the contract. A relationship that costs you your safety is not a relationship. It is an arrangement that benefits one party, and it ends when the other party decides it does. The second is this. Your silence is not weakness. My brother had always interpreted my steadiness as passivity. He read my patience as a vote of confidence in his ability to escape consequences. The most disorienting thing I did in those hospital weeks was nothing. I lay in a bed and I did not react and I did not argue and I let him believe his version of events while Marcus quietly assembled the real one. Stop defending yourself to people who have already decided what you are. Use that energy to build the case instead. The third is this. Peace is not the same as forgiveness, and you do not have to choose forgiveness to deserve peace. I have heard this my whole life. The idea that healing requires a particular emotional transaction, that you must open your hands and release the person who harmed you in some conscious, graceful act of spiritual accounting. I am not interested in that story. What I found, on the other side of all of this, is not forgiveness. It is indifference. And indifference is not cold. It is not bitter. It is simply the absence of a claim. My brother has no claim on my attention, my grief, my guilt, or my energy anymore. He is a fact of my history, the way weather is a fact of geography. It happened. It shaped the landscape. The landscape grew anyway. I have a good life now. I have an apartment with a kitchen I love, and a caseload at work that challenges me and friends who have known me long enough to notice when something is wrong, and ask about it directly. I have weekends that belong only to me. I have mornings that are quiet. I wake up and the first thought I have is not about defending myself. That is a freedom that is almost impossible to describe if you have never been without it. Look at your own table right now. Look at who is sitting there. Look at who you have been protecting and from what and for how long and at what cost. Look at who takes the last of everything and then asks you why there isn't more. Look at who calls their hunger your obligation. You cannot save them. You were never supposed to. The only person whose life you have both the right and the responsibility to protect is your own. Do that. Start today. Start small if you have to, but start. Because the ones who are willing to compromise your brakes will not stop just because you are kind. They will not stop just because you understand them. They will not stop until you remove yourself from the road entirely. I am Claire. I removed myself from the road. I am doing just fine.